Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by Elizabeth Fries Loomis Ellett. The Haunted House in Georgia. No traveler to Savannah is allowed by the citizen of that pretty southern city to leave it without being pressed to visit Bonaventure. This is a remarkable spot, 7 or 8 miles distant from town. It is reached by a drive over sandy roads, through a country pleasingly diversified with hill and valley, winding streams, and glimpses occasionally of the broad expanse of one of the arms of the sea, here called the Salt, in contradistinction to the fresh waters of the river. The country hereabout presents an agreeable variety to the low, flat region bordering the Savannah, and affording rich and extensive rice and cotton plantations. The woods are close and extensive, the foliage luxuriant and varied in character, such as enchants the eye unaccustomed to the beauty of the southern forests. Here in the spring, the queen magnolia spreads her snowy flowers, diffusing fragrance through the air, and the yellow jessamine flings its golden shower of blossoms, delicious in perfume, over the saplings and bushes. The wild rose clambers over the myrtle trees, and the bay and calico flowers decorate the borders of the streams. Evergreens are numerous. The live oak, almost unknown in the upper country, is abundant, and in the swampy spots, the trees are covered with the long, trailing garments of moss, so wonderful and beautiful to the northern visitor. These majestic vales become more frequent as you proceed, mingled with the wildest and richest profusion of deciduous foliage. The traveler, after a few turns on the road, finds himself in a spot of singular beauty. On either side stretch broad, extensive avenues, perfectly straight, as far as the eye can reach. These are bordered and enclosed by live oaks of immense size, their gloomy foliage draperied by the floating gray moss that waves like a shroud in the wind and droops almost to the ground. These avenues cross each other at right angles and are carpeted by a smooth green sward. The trees were planted many generations since by the ancient proprietor of the soil. It is impossible to describe, so as to do them justice, these stately, sweeping avenues. The antiquated, solemn appearance of the live oaks, proud monarchs of the forest, with their dark verdure and streaming drapery, the dense woods in the distance, and the air of romance, seclusion, and solitude that impresses the mind, give a unique effect to the scene. The heart is filled with calm awe. There is more here than the mere beauty of scenery, or a combination of these objects that in a landscape give pleasure to the eye. It would scarce need a poet's fancy to imagine these the lengthened aisles of some mighty cathedral, roofed by the blue sky and walled in by wooded hills. The organ's solemn influence would here be appropriate. As the sun descends, a religious gloom fills this sanctuary of nature, and the wanderer, escaped a while from the busy stir of town life, finds in the solitude and silence around him the truest aids to devotion. It is this effect, and the singular character of the scenery, that has made Bonaventure so celebrated a spot. Some of the Georgians imagine it as great a curiosity as Niagara. They quote a saying of a noted English traveler, that to see it was alone worth crossing the Atlantic. A drive to Bonaventure is the favorite afternoon recreation of the citizens of Savannah, so long as cool weather permits. But with the sunny season of May, this resort becomes dangerous. The country fever, that most alarming of all diseases, the scourge of the Low Countries, prevails throughout this region. Only the town and the dry and elevated portions of the country are safe from its ravages. The hanging moss, beautiful as it is, that grows so luxuriantly in the moist lands, is a certain token of the insalubriousness of the climate. It is a kind of banner of death. This place, in consequence, is forsaken in the summer months, or only visited earlier in the day, for with the evening comes the miasma. This circumstance imparts to it an additional interest by deepening the sense of loneliness. The solemn grandeur of the scene is marred by no habitation of man. The fear of pestilence guards the gates of this spacious temple, that the sellers and money changers come not therein. Peace, the peace of prayer, seems here to have its appropriate dwelling. About a quarter of a mile from one of the avenues there stood, a few years since, a large and strongly built house, much defaced by time, that had been for a long while uninhabited. The wild pigeons made nests in the chimneys, and some of the stones had fallen out, but on the whole, the building was in good repair, though its court was overgrown with weeds, and wild vines clambered over the windows. It was removed, and a neat small mansion erected not far from its site, where the owner of this estate occasionally resides. In his absence it is kept in order by an old servant who serves as Castellan, and who lives with his wife in a hut on the premises. It was toward the end of April 40 that I visited Bonaventure, in company with a party of friends, most of them strangers to the locality. An individual from Savannah, who kindly accompanied us as guide, was extremely communicative in regard to the different persons who had been, from the period reached by tradition, owners of the ground. One of the party observed that such a domain in England would be a princely fortune, and even here, where it had comparatively little pecuniary value, it was one which no man, who knew how to value so noble a possession, would ever part with. "Aye," answered our guide, "when it could be held with a safe conscience. The proprietor is a most worthy and excellent man. None can speak a word against his right, but that could hardly be said of the dwelling house that used to stand yonder." "The one we see here?" "No, that was built lately by the owner of this property, and is occupied when he visits the place, as Bonaventure is too sickly to live in. I mean the house which was taken away." "Did that not also belong to the estate?" "No, it never was a part of it. It was built, they say, more than 100 years ago." "Was there anything remarkable about it?" "Why, nothing one could speak of, at least in its outward appearance. It was a gloomy-looking building enough, with old-fashioned windows, and the broken-down wall you see yonder surrounding it, but it was not inhabited, though it had a fine garden and grounds attached, for 5 or 6 years before it was removed. To speak plainly, it had the reputation of being haunted. All laughed at the idea of a haunted house in Georgia at this day. You may laugh if you will, but it was true nevertheless. I know many who would not have passed a night there for any reward. And why should not ghosts appear nowadays, I wonder, as well as in old times, when there is occasion for them?" "If you can show that there is occasion," said one of our party. "Well, there are several things that might render their appearance proper. For instance, a murder unpunished, or the innocent suffering for the guilty." "Was any story of this sort connected with the house?" "Not that I knew of. I never heard of anybody being murdered there. But there was a tale. I heard it from my father, who heard it from his, of the rightful owner of the property being turned out of the house and home with his family and left to die in poverty, while another took possession of his inheritance. Of course we all inquired concerning the particulars. "I can tell you nothing but what I have heard," continued the narrator, "and hearsay knowledge is apt to be uncertain. Many years ago, as perhaps you are aware, the house and plantation were worth far more than at present. Those were the times when southern planters were like princes, and each as independent as a duke in his own castle. Then, I remember it well, the house I speak of was occupied by a worthy man. He had no children, however, and all the grounds were in excellent preservation. That wall enclosed the courtyard, and the trees within were in full vigor. There was a double row of orange trees just in front that were as beautiful to the sight as well as valuable for their fruit. The garden, I recollect, was full of choice flowers. In short, the place had everything about it desirable for a rural residence. The mansion was well furnished also, though the furniture was old-fashioned, and yet the person who lived there, though, as I said, a most upright man, seemed to be never altogether comfortable. He did not rest till he had sold the plantation and removed. Perhaps on account of the unhealthy climate? That could be, for this spot is dry and salubrious. As I told you, rumor said there were appearances in the house that could not be accounted for. The old story was revived about the transfer of the inheritance. There was a lawsuit concerning it in my grandfather's time. But the person whose father had held the property could not make good his claim, by reason of his failing to produce the documents that secured his title. So his opponent gained the cause, though almost everyone thought his claim an unjust one. And what became of the former proprietor? He left the state with his children. It was reported that he died of the fever in Alabama. A hard lot, if unjustly deprived of his property. Precisely. And that brings me to the wonderful part of my story, which proves that Providence does, indeed, watch over human affairs. I shall tell it, notwithstanding you may ridicule what I say." "Impossible, my good friend," said Mr. "Pray, let us hear the rest." "My father," continued our guide, "has often told this to me, and I know him to be incapable of any departure from the truth. He was not married at the time it happened, and was a stranger in this part of the country. He was hunting, in February, in the woods with a party of friends. It was after dark before they were ready to return, and you know what a tedious ride it is now, because of the sand, between here and Savannah. The road was then difficult to find for one unaccustomed to the forest, and my father proposed asking the hospitality of the gentleman who lived in the house I have been describing for a night's lodging. The others refused, alleging as a reason the rumors they had heard. My father was as incredulous as yourselves, and with a laugh protested that he feared neither ghosts nor devils enough to take a long ride through the woods on an uncertain road on their account. The others were not of his mind, and so my father begged an introduction to the gentleman of the house from one of the hunters, and they all rode up to the gate. The proprietor was an open-hearted man, of courteous and obliging disposition, as almost all our southern landholders are. He received the whole party with a cordial welcome, invited them to remain all night, and insisted at least on their staying to supper. His excellent wine caused the guests to be very communicative, and in the course of conversation, all that had passed between my father and the others came out. The host smiled as he heard it, but some thought his smile a forced one. In all events, when my father asked leave to stay till next morning, and his companions begged that he might be put into the haunted chamber if there was one, he promised to satisfy them to the extent of his power. The whole party made an engagement to meet next day at dinner in the hotel then standing on the corner of Monument Square in Savannah, that they might hear all that had passed. The host accepted an invitation to join them. Then, as it was late, the hunters had their horses brought to the gate and departed. My father remained alone and conversed with his new acquaintance, who seemed a man of much intelligence and information, till bedtime. That hour came earlier in former times, as you know, than at present. As the host conducted my father to his chamber, he observed with a smile that he was sorry he had no haunted room for his reception, which might afford him an adventure and a subject for their dinner's discussion. "But I will give you," he said, "the old library apartment that was formerly occupied by my father, both as study and bedroom. There are some curious volumes in it. They will give you plenty of stories of apparitions, if you choose to consult them. For my part, I am inclined to think such things exploded at the present day." It was a large, old-fashioned room into which my father was shown, with several shelves on which there were old leather-bound volumes, some in folio. He examined several that excited his curiosity, and found them valuable relics of past ages, illuminated manuscripts, ornamented with rare and curious paintings. The owner of the house had a fine taste in such things. The room was also hung with several portraits of the members of the family. The paintings were fine, though much soiled by smoke and dust, and had in the candlelight quite a lifelike appearance. It was late when, after examining them, for he had a great fondness for pictures, my father retired to rest. He was awakened from a profound slumber by the clock striking. It struck 3. He was surprised to find it so late. The moon was shining faintly in at the windows, and fell in a line of silver on the polished floor. Every object in the room was visible, though not directly in the light: the long table, with the candlesticks, the books, the massive oaken chairs, and a marble urn that stood in the corner. In a few minutes, to the surprise of my father, the clock struck 1. It had struck 3/4 before. At the same time he thought he heard a rustling in the apartment, as of someone moving behind the curtains of his bed. He partly rose from the pillow and looked around. Gradually, as vision returns to one who has been dreaming, he became conscious of seeing a figure seated in a large leathern chair, just beneath one of the portraits. It was that of a man, dressed in regimentals, as the portrait had been, and with a face so exactly similar that my father involuntarily glanced at the picture. What was his astonishment to see the frame empty! The other portrait frames that hung around the room were empty also. At the same time, he perceived other figures moving about or seated in the chairs. One was that of an old lady in a stiff brocade that rustled as she moved. another a younger female, with a bridal veil upon her head, another a middle-aged man, with a roll in his hand. Between these moved a number of other figures, less distinctly seen, their faces being hid in the shadow, and their forms, as it were, blended together. There was no noise of footsteps, but my father could hear voices whispering, and even distinguish some of the words they uttered. He thought he heard one lady, who had seated herself near the bed, say to another, "Are we to have no music or dancing any more?" The military-looking man seemed the superior among them. Almost everyone looked to him with an expression of deference, but he appeared regardless of them, and his face exhibited both concern and melancholy. He walked to and fro, my father said, with unequal steps, now stopping short, now pushing forward through the crowd, as if intent on something the rest knew nothing about. Once he came close to the bedside, and my father saw that his features were noble and expressive, though the countenance was overcast with sadness. Suddenly he went up to the middle-aged man, who was standing motionless in the middle of the room, and attempted to take the roll from his hand, saying something, of which my father could only distinguish the words, "my children," and "the papers," spoken rapidly and in seeming agitation. So great was the interest my father felt in this scene, that he forgot his fear of supernatural appearances, and watched with intense curiosity the face of the military man. This personage, after taking a few turns, in apparent perplexity, through the apartment, again went up to the middle-aged man, and said, in a low voice, but distinctly, "Be just, yield up what is not your own. Let not the innocent suffer." The other shook his head slowly. The military man turned his face so that the faint light fell upon it, and my father saw that it was distorted and dark with contending passions. The face of no living human being could have expressed so much, with such wild and terrific energy. The sight was a fearful one. My father closed his eyes shudderingly, and the next moment the whole scene faded away. The outlines of the figures first became tremulous and indistinct, then they seemed to melt into one another, and at length all was dark, for the moon went down behind the hills. A strange drowsiness, or rather exhaustion, overcame my father, and he fell into a deep slumber, from which he did not wake till late in the morning, at the entrance of the servant to inquire his commands. My father's first glance was at the portraits. They were all in their frames, as he had seen them in the preceding evening, and the picture of the military man hung directly opposite him. The host was particular in his inquiries as to how he had rested, but my father, for many reasons of his own, chose to say nothing of what he had seen. He expressed, however, some curiosity about the portraits, which the gentleman of the house was very willing to gratify. Some of them were ancestors of his own, and the man in military dress he described as having been an officer in the old war, to whom the estate had originally belonged. His right had been disputed, after his death, by another branch of the family, who succeeded in establishing their claim and obtaining possession after the tedious lawsuit I have mentioned. My father said nothing to all this, nor did he relate to the company he met at dinner the least of what had occurred. There seemed, he said, a sort of sacredness in this confidence of the dead. Besides, how could he have convinced them it was not all a dream, or a delusion of his imagination? It were most reasonable to suppose it such, indeed, answered the spokesman of our party. Nay, said the other, my father might have thought so himself, but for a singular occurrence. Many years later, some workmen employed in digging a well, there, you may see where it has been filled up, near the house, found a half-mouldering piece of parchment on which the writing was nearly defaced. It was one of the documents so long lost, and though insufficient, without others that could not be found, to establish the right of those who had been deprived of the property, yet it proved such writing to have been once in existence. But the wronged heirs were no longer to be found. The estate had been dismembered and was greatly diminished in value, and nothing was ever done with the rediscovered parchment. It was sufficient, however, to convince my father that what he had seen was no dream. A smile of incredulity was the only comment. Since then, concluded the narrator, to the day of his death, he could never look on a portrait of the size of life without a sort of horror. There was no use in attempting to shake the belief of our friend in his marvelous tale. so no further attempt was made. We only thanked him for his narration, and thought the wild and solemn scene before us a fitting one for the enactment of a ghost story. The end.